m'appelle Maurice Truflet et là c'est mon maître Louis Vierne, la meilleure organiste de la France.
C'est où, mon chéri?
Désolé, j'arrive. Monsieur Vierne? Je suis. I'm the classical nerd. Today, we're talking about Louis Vierne. Louis Vierne was born in October 1870 in the city of Poitiers. Born nearly blind due to congenital cataracts, he developed an early aptitude for playing the piano by ear. His uncle, Charles Collin, was an organist and oboist, kind of an unusual combination, who taught the oboe at the Petit Conservatoire and got Vierne on the organist route when he was 5 years old. Vierne's blindness would prove to be a constant battle because he could see a little bit. He was what we'd call today legally blind. His best sight was about 1/7 of the average, and even then only in one eye. 2 operations in November 1877 helped a little bit, but it would be a constant battle throughout the rest of his life. As compensation, his hearing was very good. He could, in a crowded street, just about pick out where somebody was, purely based on the sound of their voice. Vierne was transfixed by the organ more than any other instrument, and was nearly paralyzed in delight when he heard one in person for the first time. When he was 9, he and his family moved to Paris, where the plan was for him to work his way through their equivalent of high school and then study at the Petit Conservatoire. The Conservatoire's organ class was headed up by César Franck, a Belgian-born organist-composer with some serious sideburns. It was Franck's playing which solidified Vierne's desire to play the organ professionally, although Vierne was a nervous boy who suffered from stage fright throughout his life. The two met in 1886, and Vierne recalled in his autobiography as being terrified. Vierne began school at the Institution Nationale in October of 1880. This was a trade school for the blind initially, and had morphed over the years into a quasi-conservatory environment. The workload was enormous, and Vierne thought of it as something of an intellectual prison. His autobiography lists the average day of schoolwork as lasting 14 straight hours. 14-hour days, and they didn't even teach music history. He couldn't read very well, but he had the good fortune of being born after Louis Braille had invented his system, and so he could get an education. The trouble was that he never actually learned all that well from books. He was more of a practical experience kind of learner, and he credited performing as a violinist in the school's orchestra with teaching him more about music than anything in a single class. The two recurring themes of Vierne's life were death and general misfortune. He is the unluckiest composer I know of, certainly the most unlucky composer I've ever done a video on. And he felt things deeply. The deaths that occurred in his family and around him were exacerbated by the fact that he felt things deeply. He was a very emotional and empathetic person. His sister died not long after the family had moved to Paris, followed not long thereafter by his uncle, the same one which got him into organ playing in the first place, followed right thereafter by his father. All of these were enormous emotional blows on him, and it made it difficult for him to compete in the end-of-year exams to move on to the next level of musicianship. Eventually, he was able to use these as an incentive to be even better. He needed to honor the memory of those who had passed on by being the best he could be. Vierne's meeting with Franck in 1886 must have made a good impression on the elder composer, as he told the young Vierne that he would take him on as a pupil in his organ class as soon as he was ready, and true to form, Vierne began auditing that class in 1888. Franck's teaching style forced Vierne to write away from the keyboard, and emphasized the importance of understanding the rules of counterpoint to all late 19th century composers. Vierne had theretofore found counterpoint arbitrary and capricious. He knew that he didn't have the inherently mathematical mind of, say, a Palestrina or a J.S. Bach. But Franck, even though he understood that people weren't writing in the style of Palestrina or Bach, was able to express to Vierne and the rest of his students that it was worth learning and worth understanding the rules and the grammar of that style, because they were integral to understanding the rest of Western music, which had built on top of that edifice. If you understood how things were constructed on the most basic level, if you learned those rules, you could learn how to break them. In the organ class itself, Franck pulled the stops, meaning that his students learned more about the techniques of playing the manuals and the pedal board versus the more subtle art of registration. Vierne later pointed out that because Franck was such a fantastic improviser, and he observed a lot of the traditions of organ improvisation as a kind of spontaneous composition, many of his students didn't turn out to be great technical virtuosi as much as they were great interpreters and great improvisers and great composers. Vierne officially entered the Conservatoire in October 1890 at the tender age of 20, and he studied officially with Franck for all of 1 month before Franck fell ill and died. Vierne and his fellow pupils were heartbroken over the loss of their maître, and Vierne, from everything that I've read, has this sense of honor and honesty about him, and he was especially upset that a bunch of French musical bigwigs claimed to have been at Franck's funeral, but actually weren't. Replacing Franck was Charles-Marie Widor, another top-ranked French organist and composer, but about whom the students in the class knew very little. He was more holistic in his approach towards organ playing and had very specific ideas about how to interpret pieces and how to quite literally play the organ. Widor had a zero-tolerance policy for wasted movement, which makes sense when you think about playing the organ not just as an instrument, but as a full-body experience. You're required to think about what your hands and your feet are doing and coordinate all that. It's a wonder that people can do it at all. Vierne took this to heart and became so good at pulling his own stops, memorizing where they were and being able to scan over them with his hand and yank out the one he needed before continuing to play in time, that some people who witnessed him playing the organ didn't know he was blind just by looking at him play the organ. Franck had taught him more the expressive, emotional, and human side of improvisation, whereas Widor was much more technical in the nitty-gritty of playing the organ well. Widor told his students that they needed to learn the logic behind the pieces that they played, how they were constructed, instead of just playing them. If you just played a piece, you were no better than, in his words, a parrot. But despite all the differences between Franck's and Widor's teaching styles, they both agreed on one thing: Vierne was going places if he kept up his extreme work ethic. Within 2 years of Widor's tenure in the organ class, Vierne got the post of official substitute at a beautiful 5-manual organ at Saint-Sulpice. Widor placed a high degree of confidence and trust in Vierne's technical ability, which probably helped Vierne's chronically low self-confidence. Widor trusted Vierne to play his pieces as though he himself were playing them, which allowed him to walk out into the sanctuary and listen to his pieces being played as if he were a member of the audience. Something that's valuable for any composer. Vierne was, in almost every respect, Widor's right-hand man, which included screening candidates for inclusion in the organ class. Today, we would consider what Vierne did the role of a teacher's assistant or even a graduate assistant. Widor's time teaching the organ class was not actually that long, and he and Vierne kept in touch through having lunch on a weekly basis, but Alexandre Guillemot was hired to take over the organ class. From the beginning, Guillemot treated Vierne as his equal and not his student, and his tastes were eclectic. He was perhaps one of the few Parisian musicians whose favorite composers included Richard Wagner, Claude Debussy, and Vincent Dandy. He just liked contemporary composers no matter what style they wrote in, and he was encouraging of Vierne's early attempts at composition. Guillemot allowed Vierne's organ works to be played as part of the examinations at the end of the terms, if students so chose. On his 28th birthday, Vierne became engaged to Arlette Tascan, whose father Alexandre was actually a pupil of Vierne's for a time, despite being 17 years his elder. Widor, Guillemot, and a host of other distinguished French organists knew that Vierne was the ideal candidate to take over the Conservatoire's organ class after Guillemot, but he was snubbed for the job. Not like the guy who took over was bad necessarily, but Vierne had more experience and more longevity in the class. The problem is that whenever you talk about the Petit Conservatoire, especially in this era, there's a bunch of internal politics. Like, it's Game of Thrones, but with musicians, and no, dragons. Definitely less nudity. We got to keep in mind that this is the very same institution that had to be reorganized by the government. The government had to take over what they were doing because they kept snubbing Maurice Ravel from getting the Prix de Rome. I mean, you really could do like a mini-series of all the backstabbing that went on during those years. Vierne benefited overall from his time at the Conservatoire because it put him in touch with a lot of people who understood how talented he was, and people who wanted to give him a leg up in the world. The organ world was full of encouragement for him, especially when it came to his budding compositions. Guillemot was a big fan of Vierne's early pieces, and Vierne dedicated his first organ symphony to this teacher of his. While Vierne would later come to regard this work as somewhat amateur and in poor taste, he acknowledged that audiences always loved it. So what even is an organ symphony? Most people who hear the term are going to think of Camille Saint-Saëns's Third Symphony, known as the Organ Symphony, and that it has a prominent organ part but within a larger symphonic texture, like it's for organ and orchestra, more so than just solo organ. The organ symphonies that we're talking about here come from another tradition, which is a work of symphonic scope and scale, but for one instrument. These were especially prominent in France. French organs were built more to imitate the sounds of a symphony orchestra, whereas Germanic composers really didn't have access to those kinds of instruments. The way that organs were built in different countries meant that organ repertory in Germany developed differently from the organ repertory in France. They're admittedly kind of a strange offshoot of the symphonic genre, which flourished at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in France specifically. And some analysts have gone so far as to say, well, they're not really symphonies so much, because they don't fit the high romantic Germanic mold. They're more along the lines of suites, in that they do try to emulate the sounds and the textures of orchestras, but they don't really function as cohesive units. Oftentimes, organists will take individual movements out from these symphonies and play them in concerts, especially finales. The French and the Germans also historically haven't really gotten along, so while French composers could rightly express admiration for Bach or Beethoven, it wasn't as cool for them to like Wagner or Bruckner. I mean, they could, it just wasn't cool. Yet we see, for all this supposed animosity, a lot of Wagnerian techniques and influence in a lot of composers from this era, and Vierne is no exception. Oftentimes, you will see a strident melody in the bass, which would be the pedals, accompanied by fast-moving chords and arpeggiations in both hands. This is a classic Wagner technique. Although Wagner was scoring it for full orchestra, you can see orchestra, organ, organ symphony. It all comes together. There's also extreme chromaticism in Vierne symphonies especially. There's long-range harmonic motion which is expressed through ostinatos and pedal points, and he often goes to some extreme keys while he's going from point A to point B. Looking at the dense harmonic structure of Vierne's music is likely to give you a headache if you look too closely at it. But the idea is that he's relating keys by thirds more so than fifths. He's exploring related keys by mediant relationships, something that harkens back all the way to Schubert and Beethoven. And the forms of his symphonic movements elude traditional boxes. Musicologists have tried to say, well, it's like this but without that, or it's like this but with this added, when really he's just freewheeling forms based on little bits and bobs of others. And the attempts to put them into boxes often fail. It's just not a worthwhile endeavor. While Vierne's organ symphonies have stayed in the repertoire in a way that other organ symphonies by his contemporaries and immediate predecessors have not, it has created something of a problem when it comes to looking at Vierne as a composer. He's considered to be an organ composer more than a composer. His non-organ works have been thoroughly neglected. Like, he actually wrote a symphony, a full-fledged symphony for orchestra. I've never heard it. It's like it's never played. It's not like orchestras make a habit of really going out into the edges of the repertoire, but still, like, this guy achieved a lot in the world of the organ. Surely he has something to say in the traditional symphonic form. Okay, now it is true that his symphonies are his best pieces, and his organ works expand the repertoire greatly, and they're all multiple movements. So if you count the individual movements, he did write a lot of organ music. I want to make that clear. But if you purely look by opus number, only about a quarter of his published works are for organ or feature the organ in any significant capacity whatsoever. But in defense of this situation, his organ symphonies are clearly his most important works, and they're his most significant contributions to any genre. He took this strange offshoot of the overall symphonic form as developed by Franck and Widor and took it to its natural logical conclusion. There are no organ symphonists in the French tradition you can point to after Vierne which carry on his tradition in any meaningful way. He was the last of the breed. Vierne's 6 organ symphonies are unified by an attention to cyclicism, that is, bringing back motives across movements, not limiting the appearance of a single phrase or motif to a single movement. You can of course trace this all the way back to Beethoven, but in French music it was more explicitly and systematically exploited by César Franck. This technique allowed composers to explore a lot more material within the confines of a single piece. It allowed for going to more different textures. It allowed for going to further key areas. It allowed for more chromaticism. It allowed for even more movements than one would typically expect. Thus, even if it wasn't clear what the form of an individual movement was, over the course of an entire piece, it holds together. The cyclicism provides a structural unity to the entire piece versus individual movements. Of Vierne's 6 organ symphonies, only 1 and 3 aren't cyclic in any meaningful way, whereas 2, 4, 5, and 6 are cyclic. Strangely, the keys of his symphonies work their way up the scale: D, E, F sharp, G, A, and then B. He left a few sketches for a 7th organ symphony, although he never lived to complete these, and one wonders if this would have been in C, or C sharp minor, or C sharp major. I would not put it past Vierne to write an organ symphony in C sharp major. He writes enough accidentals as it is. Organ symphonies of this time also have a tendency towards 5-movement structures, versus the traditional 4 of the more Germanic symphonic mold. 5 out of 6 of Vierne's organ symphonies use a 5-movement structure, with only the first, the more immature one according to Vierne's own analysis, clocking in at 6 movements. The consistent employment of 5 movements seems like it's a stereotypically French thing. Historically, French opera had preferred 5-act structures, whereas Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, one of the first major orchestral symphonies written after the death of Beethoven, uses a 5-movement structure to paint a narrative, not unlike what Beethoven did himself in his own 6th symphony, the Pastoral. I guess the French just like the number 5 for some reason. Vierne's role vis-a-vis the organ symphony is similar to the role that Gustav Mahler plays in the overall trajectory of the Austro-Germanic orchestral symphony. Mahler stood at the end of the tradition there by synthesizing the old and the new, in much the same way as Vierne took the old traditions and the new traditions and mashed them up together. Classical proportions, modern harmonies, allusions to jazz, also allusions to Franck. Most attempts to label Vierne, if such labels mean anything at all, tend to land him in the camp of post-impressionist. That is, he used the impressionist harmonies of someone like Debussy, but he incorporated them into an overall harmonic structure. Debussy, for all of his consonant chords, is technically an atonal composer in that he is not worried about harmonic function. Vierne is worried about long-term harmonic function, even if it's loose. He is saturating his music with chromaticism, but it's still tonal, in a way that Debussy's music rarely, if ever, is. Debussy was all about obscuring tonality, but Vierne was about taking some of the same harmonies and sonorities and incorporating them back into the tradition. There's no evidence that Vierne consciously tried to do this, but the harmonic similarities between passages of Vierne and passages of Debussy are uncanny. We do know that Debussy was a fan of Vierne's Second Organ Symphony, but Debussy's praise for Vierne's writing was all about how idiomatic the organ writing was, and how deftly Vierne handled what's really a bulky instrument. Not about Vierne discovering some kind of new musical language, but in fairness to Vierne, his mature style evolved over the years. We see an arc from the First Symphony to the Sixth Symphony that charts the slow maturation of a unique style. One wonders what Debussy would have thought of the Vierne of the Sixth Organ Symphony. He did not live to hear the Vierne of the Sixth Organ Symphony, but he includes 12-tone passages in that work. Not serial 12-tone passages, but rather phrases that, in the course of their unfolding, include all 12 chromatic notes, which is hard to do well. There are these very dense passages in Vierne's music, but there's also modality and allusions to Gregorian chant. Their difficulty led to critics advising amateurs to stay away. But for all this talk of chromaticism, it's important to realize that Vierne didn't think of himself as a modernist. That is, he didn't think of himself as being part of the current era. He denounced eras entirely. He felt that it was important to understand what was going on in his contemporary circles, as well as understand what Bach did. But he was quick to point out that Bach did not learn what we think of as music theory, either in his day, let alone ours. He felt like the duty of the creative artist wasn't necessarily to invent something entirely new, but rather to synthesize everything that was available and that had already been invented under the confines of good taste. From a personal level of compositional ethos, I totally agree with this. I get where he's coming from. Interestingly, he also rarely performed his own organ symphonies, and I don't think he actually ever premiered any of them, although I will say that recital records are scarce, and sometimes it's hard to piece together when people played what and where. Vierne's addition to the organ repertoire doesn't just stop at his 6 organ symphonies. It also includes such works as the 24 pieces in free style, which run the gamut from fairly simple to harmonically complex and stereotypically Viernian. The pedal part for these pieces is written so as to be optional because they were also for harmonium, a smaller organ-like instrument that was often found in homes and smaller churches. Instead of a pedal board, the harmonium player had to pump bellows with their feet while they played with their hands. By making it for harmonium, he could assure that the pieces had a wider audience. But he must have hated to do that because he hated the sound of the harmonium. He called it a big nasal accordion and a bunch of other insults. In a double irony, he actually owned a harmonium. Although maybe he just kept it around so he could point at it and laugh. Not optionally on harmonium were his 24 pieces of fantasy, which came out in 4 volumes of 6 pieces each. These were his workhorses. He seems to have played these more often in his concert tours than his own symphonies. These rank up there with some of his most popular pieces. If you've heard a Vierne piece in concert, chances are that it's either a finale from one of his organ symphonies or something from the pieces of fantasy. While the symphonies demand impeccable technique, there are some pieces from the pieces of fantasy which are more easily accessible to amateur organists, or at least organists who don't have virtuoso technique. They're also apparently some of the closest pieces that we have to simulating what it was like to hear Vierne improvise. Those who heard Vierne both before and after World War I said that his improvisations before the war were much better than his improvisations after the war. There are many reasons why this would be the case, which would include a lot of things that happened in his personal life, and we're going to get to those in just a few minutes. But it fails to take into account the truly wretched, lamentable state of the organ at Notre Dame. I mean, Vierne just had to do what he had to do to accommodate what was an organ that was kind of falling apart. He first played that mighty instrument in 1893 and became its substitute when Eugène Saint-Jean, the longtime organist at the Cathedral, fell ill. Vidor told him that, hey, this guy's probably going to die pretty soon, so you need to get that substitute job to get a leg up on all the other candidates who are going to want to replace him, because this does have sort of historical significance. It is an old cathedral. People do want this job, even if the organ kind of sucks. And true to form, Vierne beat out every one of the 100 or so applicants for that position, in part by playing Johann Sebastian Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Was it a good idea for him to get this job there? Long term, probably not. The pay wasn't great, and he was left in the position of having to advocate for organ repair for most of his tenure. Vierne started in Notre Dame in May 1900, and right off the bat noticed how filthy the organ was. And when you got a blind guy saying, yo, this looks nasty, you done goofed. The problem wasn't just one problem, it was neglect. You had, over the years, a bunch of different problems which had accrued, and all of a sudden, you had a situation where the organ wasn't in the best shape. It was serviceable, so you could get by. Because it was serviceable, the parish wasn't super interested in investing the money that really was required to overhaul it and bring it up to speed. Really where it should have been if they'd invested in it over the years. Flash forward to January 1910. One of the worst floods on record strikes Paris, and moisture gets into the organ. Pipes go out of tune, go out of commission, and you have mold and mildew built up in the pipes. Just a bad scenario. The following summer, one of the worst heat waves on record strikes the city, and you have the internal temperature of the organ shooting up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Scores of people are dying every day in the streets, and pipes are coming unglued. At one point, a whole section of pipes apparently just fell off. It's a wonder that it didn't strike anybody and kill them. To get away from the heat, they found bats and swallows nesting in it. And to top all that off, during World War I, they took out all of the historic stained glass for safekeeping, meaning that there was nothing that was keeping the organ from being exposed to the worst of the elements. After the war, Vierne found an instrument that was covered in layers of dust. It was coarse and rough and irritating, and it got everywhere. Down below, the wind supply was provided by a set of bellows operators, but the parish did not employ people to do this grunt work full time, so I'm not making this up. Before each service where the organ was necessary, somebody from Notre Dame would go down to the river, gather up about a half dozen hobos, and have them pump the bellows. You wouldn't get the same people doing it every time, so the work ethic changed. Now imagine trying to deal with all these problems, trying to accommodate the failures in the organ itself, on top of not having a consistent wind supply, at a starship of a console, while being blind. That was Vierne's job for 37 years. Off and on. So if it just got that bad through neglect, the biggest question that I had when I got to this point in my research was, why on earth would Vierne want this job? Like, if he knew that the situation was bad, if Vidor knew that he'd be putting one of his star pupils in a position where you'd have to deal with that kind of stuff, why did he take that job? And moreover, why did he keep that job after he got it? The answer to this question dives into Vierne's theology. He believed that the organ shouldn't be a sideshow or distraction in church services, but rather help the faithful in their prayers. Because music expresses emotion beyond words, it's an aid to worship when used correctly. Vierne recalled being touched by letters that parishioners sent him, saying that it was his playing which was the catalyst for the revival of their faith. That's why he felt a duty towards it. It was a great organ in a great cathedral that had so much left to give. He could not let it rot. He couldn't live with himself if he did that, and so he made it his singular mission to restore the cathedral's organ to its former glory. Easier said than done. On a more personal level, because Notre Dame's organ was the one with which he was the most familiar and comfortable, that was the only place in the world where he could perform without enduring stage fright. This singular mission to restore the organ made some headway, but not as much as it needed to. They did little things around the edges, like make the wind supply electric in the mid-1920s, replacing the vagabonds from week to week. But what it needed was a total overhaul, and the more problems arose with the organ, the less the parish was willing to give. So despite chronic health issues that you think would have prevented him from doing this, Vierne sailed to America to give a concert tour in 1927 to see if he could raise funds or at least awareness of the state of this organ. It helped that his fame preceded him. Guillemot had played his organ works there beginning in around 1904, and American organists were receptive to any old world artist gracing them with their presence. This was the end of the era in which that wasn't done. We get to the 30s, and especially after World War II, it becomes much more common for European artists to come to America, and vice versa. You might be surprised to learn that Vierne did a decent amount of traveling. He was never as afraid of him traveling around by himself as his mother was. He always said that if you spoke confidently and acted like you knew what you were doing, you get along just fine. When he could tour, he toured so energetically that Vidor once told him that he'd never be fat if he kept up that pace. This American tour was more America as a continent than America as euphemism for the United States, because there were stops in Canada. Totaled about 90 days, 2/3 of them had some kind of recital, and he put over 25,000 miles under him by train. He regarded American organs as wonderful instruments to play. While perhaps not always superior in terms of sound, none could compare to the comfort he felt at the console. For Vierne, the best French organs were like luxurious horse-drawn carriages, whereas the best American instruments were like a nice Rolls Royce. A good number of these American organs were electric and could be played without the need for a stop puller, although one was definitely helpful. The tour made stops at the Wanamaker department stores of Philadelphia and New York, and their organs were color-coded for convenience. He could see general shape and color, and he wanted to see this innovation be brought universally. He wanted every organ to be color-coded in such a way because it made it so easy to understand exactly where things were, even for someone who could barely see. That never came to pass. Even electric organs today don't have this color coding. Although I do think that Walmart would be much improved if you just installed an organ in there. He noticed music everywhere in the United States and Canada, and he said that audiences were more attentive than they ever were in Europe. In part because of Vienne's relentless campaigning on its behalf, the money did start to come in to repair the organ. Although Vierne still had to fight to make sure that the organ builders who wanted in on this didn't get their hands into the different pots and start to move things around and say, well, I want to put in this stop on this manual, I want to do this thing, I want to do that thing. Vierne was like, no, I'm the one who has to play it. I have very specific standards and specifications that I want to see put into this organ. But mostly it just needed to be restored. It didn't need to be improved because everyone else had ideas of what improvement meant. And eventually it was restored in the way that Vierne wanted it to be restored and was finished in 1932. We're not done with the drama from this era though. We're going to back up just a little bit and talk about the things that kept Vierne out of commission during his 37-year run at the organ console of Notre Dame. Because technically Vierne was the organist of Notre Dame, and his assistants, people like Marcelle Dupré, were organists at Notre Dame. And at one point Vierne was out for long enough that the press started thinking that Dupré was the organist of Notre Dame, and Dupré, unwisely as it turns out, went along with this. He started calling himself the organist of Notre Dame and encouraging that behavior among people who were trying to call him by the right title. When Vierne got word of this, he was very upset. He was a letter-of-the-law kind of guy, and you can kind of see both sides a little bit, but I think Vierne's in the right here. Like, he probably didn't need to get as upset as he did and break off all contact with Dupré and consider him, like, traitorous or something. But all the same, it's like, you know, if it makes such a difference, just don't use that title. So, what kept him out of commission? Quite literally just bad luck. It rained so hard in May 1906 that even people with normal sight had difficulty judging the relative depth of puddles on the street. Vierne stepped into one the wrong way and broke his right leg in 5 different places and tore every single one of the ligaments inside it. A group of communist protesters came around and carried him back home. He tried to pay them and they refused, so I guess they were at least ideologically consistent there. And his life for the next couple of months was filled with morphine and brandy, the only 2 painkillers that they had. And even then he was in excruciating pain. The doctors had to reset it 3 different times. And after he finally recovered, it took him 2 months to learn how to walk again. The doctors told him that if it had been any worse, he would have lost the leg. As it was, he was a 1 out of 100 case. 99 out of 100 other people who had the exact same injury would have had to have their legs amputated. On top of this, once he learned how to walk again, he realized that he couldn't really rotate his ankle like he used to, so he had to reteach himself and invent, in some cases, new pedal techniques so he could play the organ approximating what he once did. And then he immediately contracted typhoid fever, and so he's just laying there with like 102-degree fever, paralyzed, because that's what it does to you when it gets really bad, and he was waiting for the nurse to draw him a cold bath, which was one of the ways you cooled off and tried to treat it back in those days. And he remembered thinking, you know, I just can't die until I finish my violin sonata. And so he had this singular focus on getting better so he could finish this work-in-progress composition. And sure enough, he did. He credited that single-minded focus with his recovery from this grave illness. Although he made sure to point out that he did not recommend that as, like, a solution to other people's problems. Like, you got typhoid fever. The correct medical solution is not to write a violin sonata. Oh, what's that? You think he's out of the woods? Oh, hardly. It wasn't long until divorce proceedings began, and the couple officially split in August 1909, with the marriage terminated. And Arlette ended up getting custody of 2 of their 3 kids, which makes sense because she was better off financially, she could see. For the kids' well-being, it makes sense. But it doesn't mean that Arlette was necessarily a nice girl. When Vierne was writing his 24 pieces in freestyle, and he wanted to dedicate the lullaby from the 2nd book to his daughter Colette, Arlette told him, "Don't bother, the kid's not yours." It's long been suspected that Colette was in fact the love child of Arlette and Charles Mouton, an organ builder to whom Vierne had dedicated his 2nd organ symphony. Oh, and the same year as the divorce, Vierne's mother died. Vierne would not see his ex-wife for 4 years, and the only reason they met again was because his son Andre died of tuberculosis in 1913. But wait, there's more! He then developed glaucoma, as if he wasn't blind enough already, so he went to Switzerland for a surgery, and then they botched the surgery. By then, World War I was raging, and Vierne had 2 family members who were caught up in the conflict, his brother René and his son, Jacques. Jacques was 17 at the time, and he needed his father's permission to enlist. Vierne was not interested in allowing this, but eventually he relented. He understood that this was something Jacques felt strongly about. This was what he felt was the right thing to do, so eventually he said, "Okay, I'll let you go and fight." 1 year to the day before the armistice, Jacques was killed in battle. And in the May of the following year, René was vaporized after he had a close encounter with the business end of an oncoming Austrian shell. After this, he developed neuritis in his right arm. I have to say, he did not help his condition. He had a medicine cabinet straight out of a Breaking Bad episode. He smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and towards the end, he started huffing ether in order to calm his nerves. He said that he was going to be stressed, so he might as well be stressed doing something interesting with his life. At the very least, he died at the age of 66 doing what he loved. At that point, his heart was so frail that just getting up to the organ loft was a struggle in and of itself. He had welcomed the prospect of death for the past 5 years, and in some cases actually wished for it. And he had a premonition from early on in his career that he would die at the organ, that he would die doing what he loved the most. The parish had informed him that the June 2nd, 1937 concert would be the final recital of secular music to be allowed in the cathedral. And it would also be Vierne's 1,750th recital of his career, which is impressive. No matter what instrument you play, no matter how old you are, that's still a lot of recitals to play, compounded by the fact that he was not in the best shape physically, literally ever, and that he also suffered from such immense stage fright. It's a testament to his work ethic that he was able to get that many recitals in. 1750 also happens to be the year of death for Johann Sebastian Bach, and if I know organists at all, they love this kind of numerological nonsense. I shouldn't call it nonsense. I'm sorry, organists. His pupils carried on the torch of his works, and his organ symphonies, unlike other organ symphonies by other composers, never went out of fashion. He was known to be a very good teacher who related music to other subjects through clever and illuminating analogies. He wanted his students to have good posture, something he inherited from Widor, but he also wanted to see them refine their interpretations through rhythm. For Vierne, rhythm was the key. It was the only way you could consistently express phrase structures in organ music. He sought integrity and good taste in performances, improvisations, and compositions. But if a student came to him with a piece that he thought was in bad taste, but at least they did so with conviction, he was willing to let it slide. Nadia Boulanger ranked among one of his many pupils, and he said that she would have become a fantastic composer in her own right if she hadn't devoted her life to promoting her late sister Lily's works, as well as being a performer and a pedagogue. The high standards he was taught lived on through those he taught, but he always seemed to have a genuine affection for his students. He always called them mon chéri, which means my dear. It's gender neutral. Vierne held iconoclastic views vis-a-vis the musical culture of his time. He believed that musicians should, first and foremost, be people of culture, who should stand against the simplification of music to fit public tastes. He disliked orchestral unions. He said that they were ineffective at improving the quality of orchestras, in large part because they dictated rehearsal time, so you couldn't get as much rehearsal time as you needed to get really good pieces out there in the world, and that if you had a poor performer who happened to be part of the union, it was much harder to fire that person than it would be if it was a non-union job. He also hated publishers, but for good reason, because the way publishers worked in France is different from the way things work now, and even the way things worked in the United States in Vierne's time. While in the United States you got royalties, or you could work out a system of royalties based on the number of sheet music copies that you sold, in France you just signed away your rights to the publisher, and the publisher had free reign to do just about anything. And they could choose to not publish your piece, they could choose to edit it as much as they saw fit, and he thought that this was not a good system. It didn't prize the composer in a way that the composer needed to be prized. If anything, the composer was ancillary, though, auxiliary to the entire procedure. It's the same reason that he felt that orchestral unions weren't a good thing, because at the end of the day, it was making the end product, the work of the composer, suffer. I will defend his publishers for a second, because writing music for Vierne was an enormous challenge. He did not resort to Braille or his own system of notation. He got oversized staff paper and took his time. He could write music in the traditional way, but because he couldn't see that well, typographical errors were prone to making their way into his published pieces. And so it was up to the publishers to edit his pieces, try to find where the phrase markings were, try to find if there was an accidental that was missing here or should be there, to find where those were and replace them. And when you're talking about passages where there are accidentals on pretty much every note and such chromatically dense textures, I can't imagine trying to edit any of that. Composition would have been a fairly slow task for Vierne had he not come from a French organ school which prized improvisation as you might recall, a kind of improvised composition. It was expected of organ students at the Conservatoire or elsewhere in Paris to be able to improvise fugues, for instance. That your improvised compositions had to be as rigorous and were held to the same standards as your written down compositions. So him coming up with a composition wasn't nearly as difficult as finding the time and the energy and the wherewithal to write it down. So Vierne editing and interpretation comes across three main problems. The first is that things like phrase markings in the published scores don't necessarily line up to how we know Vierne played some of these things. The second is that he never learned how to read a metronome. And so a lot of the metronome markings in the text of these scores have nothing to do with what the tempo actually is. He just never learned how to read a metronome properly because, give him a break, he was blind. The third intersects with performance issues in that a lot of the composers of this era had larger than average hands, and so an organist with average hands, or let alone smaller than average hands, has to find ways of getting around some of the awkward positions in Vierne's pieces without sacrificing the overall sound and texture. Close analysis of his later works reveals not just a deeply chromatic harmonic sensibility, total command over where he was on the circle of fifths, but also a willingness to be influenced by jazz chords and jazz harmonies, which is evidence that he was paying attention to Parisian popular culture of his time, but also perhaps the music he heard in America during 1927's famous tour. It's thus that some of his late pieces, like the finale to the Sixth Symphony, can veer strongly towards the carnivalesque in places. I would argue that this is intentional, that organists don't need to shy away from making these sound like exuberant pieces from a street organ, because that seems to be in part of what he was after. 3 out of the 5 movements of the Sixth Symphony end with what jazz theorists call an added sixth chord. In traditional Roman numeral harmonic analysis from the classical era, this, in a tonal context, would be some kind of inverted seventh chord, but it's really just a tonic chord with a sixth scale degree jammed in there. The joie de vivre that we hear in pieces like the finale of Symphony 6 is frankly at odds with the abysmal things that happened in his life. While it's still best to think of Vierne as embracing new sonorities in the context of carrying on the flames of older traditions, illuminating analysis made by Jonathan Bezdegian, link in the description, classifies Vierne's mature harmonic language in terms of modes of limited transposition, generally associated with Olivier Messiaen, a later French organist composer whose early career overlapped with the end of Vierne's. While Messiaen coined the term modes of limited transposition and he systematically categorized them and exploited them, they existed before Messiaen. They existed before Vierne. I mean, we had whole tone scales, you had octatonic scales, all these cropped up in the works of composers from France to Germany to Russia who were trying to find new ways of splitting up the 12-tone system, to try to figure out some new sonorities and a new grammar within the context of 12 tones to the octave. So it's unfair to say that Messiaen invented these. And when we look at Vierne's music, in the case of Bezdegian's analysis, we find a lot of what is called mode 7, which is almost a fully chromatic scale, just with 2 notes missing. There's no evidence that Vierne was consciously using what Messiaen would later come to codify, but it does help to explain how he was thinking through his harmonic language. When asked of what music was, Vierne said, "It is beautiful, because it is beautiful." For him, music didn't need to express something else, it was what it needed to express in and of itself. While beauty was its own reward, its purpose, Vierne said, was to give voice to the movements of the soul. When you take into account his numerous misfortunes and what a thoroughly unlucky life he led, It is amazing to think that someone who went through the ringer of life can come out not just understanding beauty, but being able to channel it and sing its praises.